But here's the thing. If you came from an enmeshed family, that would be criticized. Absolutely. Wanting privacy and an individual choices and decisions, that is like criticized if you come from an enmeshed family.
Because of the lack of boundaries.
Because of the complete diffused lack of boundaries. And there's also this idea in enmeshed families. Okay, so enmesh, right? We'll go back to the textbook definition.
Sorry, we got off topic.
Which I thought was where this came from. Vague, most vague. We've now decided that it is. Loss of autonomy due to a blurring of psychological boundaries. So here's like the example we give. And like people, like if you have related to episodes on parentification, we're going to have to talk about that. Because parentification often comes from enmeshment and often comes from caregivers treating children as if they're peers and not being their parents.
Or needing children to take care of them in some way, right? Like there's a lack of boundaries, appropriate boundaries in that.
And there's a big part of this, like when we talk about fierce loyalty being expected, there's also often like group think. Right? So like we all have to think the same way or think of things the same way. So like we have to, our family story is the same, mom and right? Like whatever we believe all has to be the same. There's not a lot of room for individuation and figuring out shit on your own.
Oh, that's like my remember when we talked about being child free?
Yes.
In that episode, and that like one of the things that comes up for me is like my independence is so important for me. So even as you talk about that, I'm like, ugh.
That's hard for you to think about, right?
Yeah, like pains my soul.
And so it was interesting because in last week's episode, I don't know when this is airing, but we had an episode where somebody we should we had an episode where somebody during one of the Q&A episodes, and somebody had brought in feeling like they like had to like physically distance from their parent, right? Like she said, like she like it's been 10 years that she's lived in a different city and still like can't feel that. I wonder if there's a chance that there was enmeshment there that she broke free from, and now there isn't a new way.
I would say chance is probably pretty high.
Also,
right? If that's your model of relationships, right? If you learn, okay, this means that we're close. You know how sometimes people are like, oh, we had such a close family growing up. And like typically that is kind of
like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, what's that even mean? And sometimes close family is like, we all think the same. We all do things together. That there's no room to individuate, right? And so,
and what does individuate mean? Be an individual person. Just
being an individual, being able to develop and understand your own thoughts separate from other people. And I think that can be so hard when that's your model of relationships, and then you grow up and you get into other relationships. You bring that model into your romantic relationships, into your friendships. And if your friends or your romantic relationships have different models of relationships that they're bringing in, it can cause tension. It can cause friction.
Yeah. And that friction, right? That's when we start getting towards cutoff. So when we talk about boundaries being reciprocal, right, there has to be like an other side. So if I come from a really enmeshed family, it may feel like the only way to separate is to completely cut off. And that is a very unfair position for many people to be put in, which is if I go against my family rules, the things that are defined, one of those family rules is like fierce loyalty, not talking back, only having groupthink. Then I have to figure out some way to have a relationship with these people. When I have crossed the family rules, there's a risk of 1, getting kicked out of my family of origin, 2, not being and not being welcomed back in, and losing my role in the family. If I go against the family rules, what happens to me?
Oof.
If I stop being the peacemaker, if I stop being the participants in the group think, what then happens to me? That's really scary.
Right. There's like a fear of rejection.
Yeah. So when we talk about boundaries, it's talked about in this really like oversimplified idea. Boundaries can be completely fucking heartbreaking and like turn everything around for you if you're coming from a family like this.
Oh my God. Yeah. It can be so hard. And I know we say it like very like clinically.
Yes.
But if you come from a family like this, it's very scary to set these boundaries.
Yeah. Because what will happen?
What will happen?
What happens to me?
Right. And when you're growing up and you're younger, it's essential to your survival to be a part of your family. You can't survive without being a part of your family.